The language they spoke was descended from what the Romans spoke. It was the Romans' language, or Romance. And in the stories and poems that were recited in Eleanor's court, wars and heroic male battles with bad men and monsters were replaced with stories about love between men and women. It was the beginning of an entirely new kind of literature, and we still call it by the same name, romance. I swear to you on my faith, without you my joy is lost. When you are out of my sight, I pine away to death. Instead of repressing the power of sex, as the church had sought to do, Eleanor's court of love tried to harness sex into a civilizing force. The all-male virtues of killing one another were to be rechanneled into acts of love. The old battle stories about King Arthur, for example, were rewritten as a romantic saga about the adulterous love between Lancelot and Guinevere. Of course, for noblemen, the favoured form of self-expression was still violent physical contact with each other. But now they did it for the sake of a lady. This was what transformed the tournament from a full-scale mock war into an elegant jousting contest. The object originally had been to take prisoners and ransom them. Now it was to win a lady's favour. One nobleman, Ulrich von Liechtenstein, undertook what he called his Venus fart. And before you get the wrong idea, that's German for Venus journey. Ulrich claimed that in 1227 he'd travelled from Venice to Vienna, dressed in the arms of Venus and challenging anyone to joust with him. If they beat him, he'd give them a valuable ring. But if he beat them, they would have to bow to the four corners of the earth in honour of his lady. After about a month of this, Ulrich reckoned he'd broken about 307 lances on his opponents and given away about 271 rings. Not exactly a winning streak. His lady said she was surprised to hear he'd still got all his fingers, whereupon he cut one of them off and sent it to her. Apparently it was just what she wanted. Giddy up. There is a natural connection between romance and looking good, and the Arab world had always taken personal hygiene seriously. Unlike Christian Europe, Arabic public baths were an old tradition inherited from the Roman Empire. These became fashionable in Europe when the Crusaders came home, but with one crucial difference. They were open to men and women at the same time. Perhaps inevitably, they turned into brothels. London tried to regulate this trade and began licensing brothels in 1161. And while the church still vociferously disapproved of any sexual activity, there were many within the church who could appreciate the commercial possibilities. In London, brothels were officially licensed, and many belonged to no less a person than the Bishop of Winchester, and the women in them were known as Winchester geese. While back in France, the French king, Louis IX, made prostitution illegal in 1278. Mark you, this proved so unpopular he had to repeal it 2 years later. And when King Louis went on crusade, the account books show that he was paying 13,000 prostitutes to keep the troops happy. The church eventually named him as a saint, though not because of that. There must have been times when the church felt that it was on a losing wicket, trying to stem the constant tide of sexual activity that kept the human race going. But occasionally, nature would give her a hand, as happened towards the end of the 15th century. As that hardline Protestant church reformer John Calvin put it, God has raised up new diseases against debauchery. In fact, it was just one disease, but it was serious enough to transform the sexual landscape. We know it as syphilis. Syphilis first appeared in 1495 in Naples here. A French army, which consisted of men recruited from all over Europe, had captured the city. With them, they had 800 prostitutes. And when a Spanish army joined them, the new disease broke out and everybody started blaming everybody else. The French called it the Neapolitan disease, and the Neapolitans called it the French disease. The army was decimated, and the surviving soldiers were sent home to spread the disease to wherever they came from, all over Europe. Soon in northern Italy, they were reporting a new illness, the Spanish disease. England caught the French pox. In Poland, they had the German illness, while in Russia, they were going down with the Polish sickness. It reached Scotland in 1497 and India in 1498. From there, Chinese junks carried it to Canton by 1505. In 10 years, syphilis had girdled the earth. Across Europe, one of the first reactions to the disease was to declare a war against prostitution, which, as far as hygiene is concerned, probably wasn't a bad idea. In 1546, Henry VIII closed down all the brothels in London, while in Paris in 1560, prostitution itself was declared illegal. In Germany, one prostitute was savagely whipped and had her fingers chopped off. And men were punished as well. But it was women who bore most of the blame for the new disease. As far as men were concerned, it was all their fault, and all the fault of their insatiable sexual appetites. If only men could exert more control over women and over their desires. The only snag was that in those days, nobody, or at least none of the men, had much idea of what made women tick sexually. It was an enigma. Well, it may come as a surprise to learn that the answer was one of Columbus's great discoveries. But not Christopher Columbus. He found something much bigger. This was Rinaldus Columbus. He was an Italian lecturer in surgery. And in 1559, he announced to the world that he had discovered the seat of women's delight. He had discovered the clitoris. It gives Columbus Day a whole new meaning. Now, we're not suggesting there's any connection, but the century following the momentous discovery of the clitoris saw the rise of a new prudery. Puritanism was in part a reaction to what was seen by some as the licentiousness of the Roman Church. And it certainly provided some novel solutions to the perennial Christian quandary between condemnation of sex and the natural urges of men and women. In rural areas of northern Europe and New England, the Puritans tried a curious way of controlling premarital sex. Courting couples were allowed to go to bed together, but with a bundling board in between them. That way they could talk, but not touch. Of course, this method relies on the well-known fact that young people have no more sex drive than their elders, and far less ingenuity. The greatest challenge to the church was not to come from hordes of sex-crazed pagan worshippers or from profiteering brothel owners. The great challenge came from the rise of scientific discovery. But oddly enough, instead of embracing sexual activity as part of the human experience, the scientists still clung to the old Christian aversion to sex. But with this difference, they tried to provide a scientific rationale for it. Sexual desires that had been sinful, were now seen as signs of illness, and as always, women seemed to suffer most.
If they, for example, participated in such things as masturbation, if they certainly had sex before marriage or sex after menopause, those were all thought to be examples of women's abnormal sexuality, and in that case, a woman might have been diagnosed a nymphomaniac. Women might have their ovaries removed, and the other, less frequently performed operation, but it still happened in both England and America, is a clitoridectomy, where women's clitoris would be removed.
And it wasn't only women who could suffer as a result of masturbation, men too. Dr. Atisso, a medical advisor to the Pope in 1760, published his research showing that playing with yourself drives you mad.
Dr. Atisso medicalized, if you will, masturbation. Now we had a reason, that if you had too much sex, if you masturbated or then you would go crazy, blind, make hair grow in your hands, make you become an imbecile. And so many men were castrated, resort to castration in order to not have this sex drive, and then you couldn't touch yourself to relieve yourself.
A less drastic solution was urgently needed. And since tasty foods like ham and eggs were supposed to increase a young man's libido, in 1898, one Dr. Kellogg offered a replacement breakfast.
Cornflakes were invented to stop people from having sex drive and stop them from masturbating. Dr. Kellogg was trying to develop a grain or a food to reduce the sex drive.
The only trouble was, Dr. Kellogg's original cornflakes were so tasteless they were hard to sell. So the original formula was made tastier, destroying the anti-libido effect, and he walked off in disgust. In the 19th century, the church's aversion to sex was reinforced by supposedly scientific theory. Maybe this double damning of sex gave the authorities more power to control the potentially explosive concentrations of population in the new industrial cities. Sex was seen as a threat to law and order, and even to the British Empire itself. The only snag was that the Victorians were increasingly interested in the classical world, and the recent science of archaeology was throwing up a lot of embarrassing detail about pagan life. I'm in London at the British Museum, a place where huge collections of material from the ancient world can be seen by the public, or hidden from them. Dr. David Gamester is the keeper of what I was told is their secret collection. The British Museum are very insistent that it's not really secret at all. I mean, anyone can make an appointment explaining exactly what they want to see and why, and then they just have to be escorted and supervised. Open to all, really.
David, I understand this is Cabinet 55, but it used to be called the Secretum?
It used to be called the Secretum of the British Museum.
Yeah. This
is now the last sort of vestige of what was a segregated part of the collection, particularly during the 19th century when it was founded. And it was really designed to hold objects which were at that time felt to be too sensitive, too delicate for all members of the population. I think that there was a genuine fear amongst the ruling classes that if the lower order had got access to pornography, to the obscene, who knows what that would have made of the edifice, of the structure, the social structure that existed at the time.
So sex was a threat?
Sex was an absolute threat.
Every 19th century British schoolboy learned about Roman gods like Mars, god of war, Jupiter, god of thunder. But the statue in any normal Roman garden was of another god, offspring of the goddess of love and the god of wine, Priapus, god of the big willy.
This is Priapus himself, walking along with his extra set of phalluses.
Well, I thought it was a bunch of bananas. Was there a fear about this cupboard being opened up? What would happen if this cupboard was opened up?
There's a genuine fear that access to this view of history would really threaten the established history of great empires.
What, such as the British Empire?
Such as the British Empire.
Well, the cupboard's open and the empire's gone, so they were obviously right. And it wasn't just old empires that were fearful of the power of sex. The new ones were too. 19th century America, like Victorian England, was one big bundle of contradictions when it came to making laws about sex. In most American states in the 1880s, for example, the age of sexual consent was just 10 years old. In Delaware, it was 7. It wasn't raised to 60 until 1889. And this is when the moral majority were busy making laws to control people's sexual behaviour. Well, some of these laws may seem pretty unbelievable to us now. But what's even more unbelievable is that many of them are still in force. In Rombach, Virginia, for example, it's still illegal to have sex with the lights on. In Florida, it's illegal to handle a woman's breasts, ever. In Washington, D.C., it's illegal to have sex in any position but the missionary position. While in Indiana and Utah, an erection that shows through a man's clothing is illegal. So, Mr. and Mrs. Clinton of Rombach, Virginia, You better put those lights out now. The history of sex and love is surprising because it's also the history of men's quest for power and for control over his fellow human beings. The goddess of ancient Israel was wiped out of history by the power of the priests. The world of pagan belief was destroyed by the church. Sexual love, which had once been understood as divine and life-giving, was turned into deadly sin. Women were taught that their sexual appetites were too voracious, and then that they virtually had none, all in the interests of keeping males in the driving seat. The ancient world, which was supposed to be admired, had its shameless phallic enthusiasm hidden away for fear that forces would be unleashed that could not be controlled. Well, the old players are still in the game, linking sex to sin, disease, and anarchy. But now there's a new joker in the pack, redefining human sexuality. The large corporations and their marketing departments. The problem with the business of selling us sex is that you've already got it for free. You don't have to mine it or grow it or make it in a factory. But this is where our moral leaders can give the sex salesman a hand, because the more they say it's forbidden, the more chance there is of selling it on the sly or under the counter. It's an entire industry built on guilt. Well, it has to be to make money. And nothing sells like sex. That's why there's so many programs about it on TV. Of course, this program doesn't count because this is a serious program, which is why we're making it and why you're watching it. The aim of advertising is to keep us eternally wanting something we can't quite get. Well, sure, you can buy the can of Coke, but you can't buy the happy life that goes with it in the ads. We must be the only society in history that functions by keeping its population permanently dissatisfied. And the all-pervading presence of sex is a part of that, on the street and on the internet. Type sex into your search engine and you'll come up with 50, 60 or even 80 million sites. Sex is now all around us in a completely different way from ever before. Commercialized and illegitimate at the same time. And there's a common message coming from both sides of that divide, which is about what is normal about human sexual behavior. Well, if this quick skip through the surprising history of sex and love shows anything, it's that there's nothing particularly normal about human beings.